Hey everyone, and welcome to this seminar about how central banks should manage their people and software under the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy as pioneered by the Central Bank of Armenia, a topic that is especially interesting right now in light of Bernanke's review of the Bank of England, where he criticized the bank, and I quote, for having unwieldy and an inflexible system that limits the ability of the staff to undertake potentially useful analysis. So, how can a central bank, and especially a smaller central bank, organize their staff and software to avoid this outcome that Bernanke describes? Well, I'm happy to say that today we again have a great roster of speakers to talk about these issues. First, Haik Avetian from the Central Bank of Armenia will talk about the role of the staff and the board under Mark II, as well as the HR model that ensures high levels of central bank efficiency as well as a much better work-life balance. Second, Douglas Lexton, who used to work for the IMF and Bank of Canada, and now at the Better Policy Project, will talk about how the global forecasting school and dynamic learning environment allows smaller central banks to pool their resources. And then last but not least, Bob Ford, who has worked at the OECD, IMF, and the Bank of Canada, will provide his reflections on the new CBA framework, as well as on Bernanke's recommendations to the Bank of England. So without further ado, I give the floor to Haik Avetian for the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Yuri, for the introduction. Before I go directly to the topic, I will just want to give some context on the history, how we get there in terms of introducing the new framework. It has started basically in October 2022 with the paper that our Garn Galasian, co-authoring with Doug Luxton and David Archer, actually had published the first view about how can a central bank in practice, in a systematic way, do the risk management approach to the monetary policy and introduce the framework and the key aspects of those framework. After basically the publication of the paper and the discussion and the talk that the government gave at the IMF, we were continuously working over the course of this 1 year and a half, getting feedback from different experts, from different economists and policymakers of all over the world, including Laurie Summers, Charles Goodhart, Bob Ford, actually, who is with us here to discuss the topic, and many others, basically getting the feedback about the different aspects of the framework. And finally, in January of this year, we have, in a symposium here, we have officially launched the framework. And then in March of this year, during our first full monetary policy round of this year, we have published the first ever monetary policy report done under the risk management approach to the monetary policy, and you can see that on the screen. But if we go now to the core of the question, how this basically the monetary policy report is in practice is produced, and here we touch upon the key aspects of the processes, how the processes, internal communication between the board and the staff, and how the roles are defined in this process. To go into the first question, when we want to define the role of the board in this production process, here is given the schematic view of how the process during the actual policy round is going on. But board engagement into the process starts even before that. What is the key point that we want to emphasize under this framework? That the board, but we have an extensive engagement of the board in the process of discussing all the uncertainties, defining all the risks, basically discussing that continuously on a continuous basis when all the risks or the hypotheses have risen, and then what is exactly done during this 28 days of policy making round actually is only kind of drafting the final messages and reports and finalizing all the analysis that the board wants to put under their particular policy decision and to communicate that to the public. And here we can see that during this actual policy making round, 28 days policy making round, we have 3 main interactions with the board. During the first meeting, which we call kickoff meeting, the board members actually start, the staff gives the presentation about the current stages, and the board members start discussing and bringing all the uncertainties and issues that they find interesting and important for during this particular round to stress and to include into the communication documents later on. Later, the board members working with the 2 level 2 GFS coordinators from the staff, they draft one-pager narratives for their basically about their favorite scenarios, or the list of the scenarios, the ingredients of the scenarios that might that they think that is important to put on the table while discussing the monetary policy during this particular period of time. And here again, you can see extensive engagement of the board into the core of the process, while the two economists from the team are providing professional help, support to the board in defining or designing this mostly qualitative assessment of the scenarios. Later on during the issues meeting, of course, all the interactions between the board members happen about the scenarios, and finally this meeting is finalized with the chief economist actually and the staff choosing 2 illustrative scenarios out of all the possible scenarios that the board members as a group identified as the key sources for the uncertainty and the key sources for the risk that they want to put on the table, and also communicate to the public about those risks that they think are important for this particular point for the policy. But at the same time, of course, the case A and case B illustrative scenarios, those just are illustrative cases out of all these possible scenarios, just to give some reference points for the board members later into the discussion. And finally, of course, any policy making round usually ends up with a policy decision where the board members basically based on the identified risks and sources for uncertainty, and based on the least regret approach they employ, they make a decision about the monetary policy. And of course, the communication comes after. During the communication process, important thing that the board engagement is also very important during the communication stages. And here we have, after the policy decision is made, the same day we publish the transparency report, which includes the full discussion, the minutes of the board meeting, with the full discussion of the dynamics that happened in the board meeting. And finally, this transparency report will also include, since September this year, it will also include the publication of individual board members' final explanations of their words or their decisions, which again shows how big it will be the role of the board, both not only in the process but also in the communication stage of the policy as well. This is mostly defining the role of the board in the process, and you can see how extensive this engagement is. At the same time, of course, now we have to redefine, in a sense, the role of the staff in the process, and this is very important because this also changes the specific requirements from the staff, in a sense. In fact, the staff in this process acts as a kind of takes as a more professional role in providing professional analysis and scenarios to the board and advices on very different professional issues, professional topics to the board. And here the problem and then we come up with as I mentioned, this requires a full rethinking of the role of the staff and also full rethinking of the new requirements for the human capital inside the framework. And here again, this raises the key issues, the key challenges, or the problems that we were facing under Mark II framework, and I guess many central banks who have been operating in Mark I framework also were facing similar problems. The key ones that I wanted to highlight, this of course are the human capital development and the key requirements, as I mentioned, to the staff members. The second one is how the trainings are and capacity development and personal development issues are resolved in the system, and those were very important issues under Mark I as well. And finally, the efficiency of the processes and the efficiency of the processes and organization of the teams during the processes to increase the productivity and the standards of the production, the produced materials that we have. Of course, those are the key problems. The main one important challenge that directly kind of rises out from the Mark II framework is, of course, associated with this new way of thinking with regard to current economic situations when we are drifting away from the baseline scenario when all the effort and interest and the discussion were put to design a baseline scenario. Rather, in this case, the requirement under the risk management approach, the stress or the emphasis is on understanding or identifying the key sources of the risk and trying to bring all these different sources or the different uncertainties on the table for the discussion, which requires a completely different kind of mindset in designing or defining the processes. And hence, it also changes the requirements to the staff members. In that sense, basically, we are taking this, and you have seen this multiple times during different presentations. This basically became the motto or the slogan for our human capital development and HR capital development strategy and the HR model under the Mark II framework. This quote that Stan Fisher basically referring back to Nelson is telling that we would rather have Bob Solo than an econometric model, but we'd rather have Bob Solo with an econometric model than without one. And the key issue and the key point that I wanted to highlight here, which is essential and especially important under Mark II, is that we want to have more stress on economics and less stress on technical discussions, which basically were happening under baseline scenario creation, when the most emphasis was on the technical discussion of some baseline scenario rather than the key parts of the stories, the uncertainties, sources of the uncertainties, and the sources for the sources of uncertainties, which required more economics thinking and more economics into more economics in the discussion. So in that sense, the stress basically and the requirements to the staff members is changing, and I wanted to highlight two aspects of that. The first thing is that we stress for critical thinking, but not in a separation, but the critical thinking with another skill, which is a synthesizing skill, because critical thinking is all about like analyzing the issues and analysis issues, which is obviously important, as I mentioned, because now we are concentrating our analysis on different aspects rather than concentrating on only one scenario, but we are analyzing different multiple scenarios, multiple hypotheses, multiple sources of uncertainties and risk, and that obviously requires critical thinking there. But at the same time, it's important that after all this discussion or these pieces of having all these pieces of the puzzle, finally, if we want to come up to a conclusion in terms of the policy, we have to somehow synthesize to get the puzzle basically ready as a drawing. In that sense, those two skills are becoming the key aspects for our requirements from our staff. The second one, which we somehow touched upon, Armen Nurbekian discussed this last time, is about the specialization and how much specialization we want from our staff actually. And in that sense, of course, what we have designed, we want to have more generalists in our team. But we later on, I will be talking about the roles of the teams and the rotational mechanism. But at the same time, we want to allow specialization. We want to allow specialization to happen there, in a sense that the specialization would be mostly related to the development agenda, to the research agenda that any member in the team will be later on having on. I will touch those issues more thoroughly when I will be discussing the organizational stuff later on in my presentation. But at the same time, I have highlighted these key aspects of the characteristic that we want or we think from our team members, of course, and of course, more economic thinking rather than technical way of thinking. But at the first stage, we have to understand that we have to create sufficiently or appropriately designed environment to bring up these kind of characteristics or this type of skills and characteristics in our staff members. What we call the environment, which is designed to basically support this development or capacity development of staff of a person inside the monetary policy department. We call it the dynamic learning environment. It has four main kind of pillars that we wanted to emphasize, which again I want to stress is designed especially to help the development of these key characteristics that we are thinking from our staff members. The first one is, of course, the commitment to excellence. This is the first pillar is commitment to excellence. This is important because, of course, we want from our staff members not to concentrate on specific piece of knowledge or specific piece of information that they have and try to use in any particular situation. And this goes back to this specialization versus generalistic approach to our staff members. Here we more want everyone to take initiative to get into many different topics, many different parts of the economy, fields of the economy, but rather than concentrating on specializing on only in information or the knowledge in specific area of the economy. And of course, here when we are talking about the generalist, I want to stress and I emphasize this part that generalists doesn't mean that they have to the specialists have to talk about everything, but on a shallow level. But rather, the generalistic approach to our approach to the definition of the generalists is that everyone has the same set of tools, in a sense, and the same set of knowledge and skills that they can apply to every different aspects or fields of the economy, or even to different countries, and analyze, and having all those necessary sets and skills they can apply to different fields and different economies and analyze it properly up to the standard that we are setting there. It doesn't compromise the standards, but rather increases the standards, but mostly changes the focus from the training or from the training perspective, and also from the requirements perspective. The second pillar that is important in dynamic learning environment is the approach to the learning process. Rather than concentrating on the learning, which is so-called hierarchical, when we have the lecturer and then the staff who is getting the knowledge from the lecturer, here we are concentrating on a non-hierarchical approach to learning, which means that every person, every team member has certain skills and certain type of knowledge that could go to hard and to soft skills and to hard knowledge. And anyone in the team members can and should, in a sense, utilize and take this opportunity of working with this particular guy. For example, I have always advising our young people to take this advantage while working with, for example, Doug or with Haikas or with other people in our team who have more advanced skills or more advanced knowledge in certain particular areas, and they can basically benefit from these interactions. And this non-hierarchical approach of learning will, at the end of the day, it's very difficult to kind of push forward during the transition period, but at the end of the day, this will emerge into a kind of a more natural way of learning inside a professional environment. Finally, the third pillar is about the feedback process, which is again which becomes as a natural part of all these development issues. But I wanted to especially emphasize the global engagement part of this dynamic learning environment. What does it mean? It means that we, at some point, we could realize that the challenges and the problems that the central banks are facing, especially in the monetary policy area, but also in other different areas, are in a sense similar in many countries. Very recently, when we started working more closely with our Georgian colleagues, we realized that all the issues and topics and problems that we are facing are more or less similar, and that especially gives us more kind of motivation just to start pooling resources, especially if you are working in a resource-constrained countries like Armenia and Georgia, to pool resources together in order to analyze similar issues and basically come up with good pieces of high-standard research to addressing this particular issue, which could be beneficial both for Armenia and for Georgia and for other countries as well. And in that sense, this is one aspect of the global engagement that I wanted to emphasize. Another aspect of the global engagement is obviously all those seminars, a series of seminars that we have started basically already 1.5 years ago to conduct, and during all those seminars, those are the good opportunities for our staff to present what they are up to and what they are working on, and to get feedback from scholars or peers from different central banks or researchers from all over the world. And that's and this has been kind of a new normal for all of us, when every week, at least twice, we are meeting here and utilizing this platform to share ideas and to get feedback from our external advisors and from the peers. And this is another aspect of the global engagement that I wanted to highlight as part of the general environment that is designed to support the development of our human capital not only in Central Bank of Armenia, but also in all the central banks that are engaged in this platform. And finally, I wanted to now because we have talked about the board and the role of the board and the role of the staff. Especially I highlighted the requirements from the staff members, but very important is to also talk how we organize all those processes there in order to increase the efficiency. And here the schematic view that we have on the presentation on this slide, I want to give you some important aspects of our organizational framework. when we are working with them 4 teams of 6 people, and that means that team 1, which again consists of 6 people, there will be in every monetary policy round, and we have 4 in a year. Every team will be taking ownership and responsibility for that particular round. But that doesn't mean that other teams are kind of are on vacation or enjoying their time off at some places. That means that the other teams are working on different other topics. I will elaborate further a little bit later. So team 1, which is taking the ownership, basically is coordinating all this process during the policy round, working with the board members, putting together all the pieces of analysis that we have, and drafting the monetary policy report and all the communication document, basically coordinating the normal policy round. But at the same time, we have the team 2, which is a backup. Again, 6 people in a team 2, which is a backup team. Backup team means that they will be supporting or team 1 on drafting specific boxes or specific more specialized topics, which will be again be part of the monetary policy report and or the communication document. At the same time, we have 2 other teams who during this period are working on certain research projects on or their personal development objectives. Why do we think that this design of the rotational way of organization is important for the development of the team members and also to increase the efficiency? Because here in this process, we can see that every team member in a year is at least one round is engaged in the full monetary policy production process. At the same time, every team member is engaged in research projects and in development projects. This is basically solving one very big issue that we were facing under Mark I framework, when we had dedicated teams for the development, dedicated team for the production process, and there always was this $100 million question: how to organize these processes or the rotation between these teams or between the members in these teams to allow everyone to dedicate enough time for their personal development. Especially this was a very kind of topical issue then. But now in this process, when we have this rotation of the teams between them rounds, we basically allow this to happen there. At the same time, as I mentioned like earlier, the specialization and how big the specialization could come. This also helps to somehow solve this issue, because what we require from every team member to have all these skills and knowledge which are required from them as generalists to engage during the production process, to do the key types of analysis that is required, or scenario ability that is required for the monetary policy design. But at the same time, they can specialize during their research projects and specialize on the topics that they are more interested in or they are more keen to work on. That's again solving this issue and basically attracting basically allowing or motivating team members to be part of this process. And finally, this also increases the efficiency of the work. Why? Because if you can see everyone, basically every team, it consists of 6 people. At the first sight, we can see we can have a big question whether this is enough, right? But at the same time, we can see that obviously this is enough. Why? Because if we identify what are the key aspects of the process that the team members are working during the production round, we can see that those are mostly related to analyzing certain parts of the economy, certain fields of the economy, and basically concentrating more on drafting the monetary policy report and finalizing the set of the scenarios that we have to communicate to the public, and basically and also to put on the table for the board members to make a decision. If we identified clearly what we want from the team to do, then we can see that obviously the 6-member team is basically enough to coordinate all those processes, but at the same time getting all the support from the other teams, especially from the backup teams in terms of the specific pieces of analysis. This is now basically gives us all these solutions basically to all of the questions that we had previously in our framework. And now the key question raises how we have to also augment or adapt the training system or the training professional development and training processes, which Doug will be talking in a minute, to allow to develop all those teams, generalists, but more specialized in terms of the research and doing high-level policy research, but at the same time, to get all those necessary, we call it advanced communication skills, to work with the board members and with the general public in terms of the communicating the monetary policies. This will become the key aspects which will define our training, our professional development and professional training process that Doug will be talking about in a minute. Probably I will stop here and pass floor to Doug. We'll talk about the training part. Thanks.
Thank you, Haik. I thought that was really interesting that by switching from this baseline, that you actually need more skills for the staff in the sense that or different skills, right? That I've made a couple of models myself back in the days, and I've noticed that indeed, if you have like one model outcome, you can get away with not actually knowing that much about how the model connects to the real economy, and you can focus on the technical details. So I thought that was a really interesting part of your presentation, that you found out like, hey, if we do this scenario analysis, our staff needs to know the technical stuff as well as the economics behind it. And I can see that that's a difficult problem to get them ready for that. But one other key takeaway from your presentation for me was that, you're not just asking your staff then to just get better. You're also providing the support and trying to help them to become better and mastering all of these skills. And I assume that or it seems like the rotation of teams is a crucial part of it. Because, how else can you become a generalist other than just, doing everything once a year? So very interesting. And yeah, I'm really interested to see how Doug feels about developing these advanced communication skills.
Doug, you're on mute.
Yeah, can you let me share my
sure.
my screen, Haik? Okay. So I guess the first point that I would say is congratulations to the Central Bank of Armenia, because when you're doing something like this, you have to manage production and you have to develop this new framework at the same time. And doing something like that requires incredible intense effort, both on behalf of the board and the staff and so on. So the first point I would make regarding training and so on is it's a lot easier to train people now when you have something functioning than when you're in the process of building it and collecting feedback and so on. The other thing that was interesting that's related to the issue about the Bank of England is that we have the advantage that we're much smaller. Okay, that these kinds of issues are, I think, much more difficult when you have large institutions and history and a specific history. It's kind of hard to. It's even more difficult to change things when you have more people involved in it and so on. So, what I'm going to talk about is the dynamic learning environment. Okay, why do we have 4 6-person teams and so on? And the analogy that we're going to use is to volleyball. Volleyball is a really good one because in volleyball, the people have to play all 6 positions. Sometimes they have to play defense, sometimes they have to play offense. Sometimes their role is to set up the other players to spike the ball and so on. So the system that Hike has designed here, and I always tell the students this, just imagine that you might be the manager like Hike one day. How would you want it to look like? And I think that's what leads us to 4 6-person teams, because if you have a person that gets sick or something comes up, you always have a backup team or a backup person that can step in very quickly to the role that's being played. And you have 2 other teams that are basically working on developing their analytical skills or the analytical framework to get ready to enter the game in the future and so on. So why 6 people? It's very, very difficult to get more than 6 people to basically function and to communicate with each other. So I have a long history helping central banks develop these frameworks. You might even say I was responsible for some of the errors that were propagated, in the sense that my experience at the Bank of Canada for 13 years, which of course is a big central bank, it was organized in a way where you had tons of resources. You had a bunch of people doing current analysis. That's where I started at the Bank of Canada. I rotated from one current analysis job to another current analysis job and bounced back between those kinds of jobs and research and so on. So I was constantly kind of moving from one job to the other, and then eventually took over the coordination of the projection process, and then eventually was put in charge of developing the framework in the late 1980s to support what we would call FPAS Mark 1. But it was done with tons of people involved in the process, and that problem created massive coordination issues and so on. So what are we doing? We're trying to create economists that can do it all. And so they need to do current analysis. They need to know how to build the scenarios and do policy analysis. They need to be able to communicate with the board and obviously write great monetary policy reports to communicate with the outside world. And they need to have a good grasp of what we would describe as modern macroeconomics and so on. So I think that that would be some of the key points that I would make. Now, it's interesting because when I ask the senior people that have been involved in developing FPAS Mark II, I asked them, in light of these recommendations by Bernanke, is that if you had a lot more resources, how would you change it? Okay. And the answer is not much, actually. You'd still stick with 4, 6 person teams because that's just efficiency. The quality and the standards of those teams would obviously improve because you would be able to attract talent because you had more resources to attract more talent. But I think that sort of speaks to the efficiency of this dynamic learning environment where people are learning from each other. There's less of a hierarchy where you're going and listening to somebody lecture, hoping to learn the truth about something, and more critical thinking and more learning something, internalizing it, and testing people. So these are 6 of the younger students that are currently in the global forecasting school. 3 are from Armenia and 3 are from Georgia. Again, a 6-person team that on some cases we divide them into groups of 3. Sometimes we divide them into groups of 2, but they're being tested effectively on a daily basis to make sure that they can do all of these tasks, that they can do current analysis up to standards, that they can generate scenarios up to standards, and that they can produce monetary policy reports up to standards. So now, how are we training them? Now that we've developed FPAS Mark II, when we first developed FPAS Mark II at the Central Bank of Armenia, we used the United States as a laboratory because, obviously it's a very data-rich environment. We had the Atlanta Fed's GDP now and sticky price inflation. So there was a lot of things there that was current analysis and nowcasting up to what we consider to be the best of the best types of standards. So, and in addition to that, because many of the issues are sensitive, it's hard to develop a framework and do policy at the same time. It's much easier to discuss the ideas and to test the ideas working on the United States. Now that we've done that, now the students are applying the FPAS Mark II ideas to other country cases. So we have examples where Sergey is working on applying it to the United Kingdom. Anna is working on, I think, what country is Anna? Czech Republic. Okay, an FPAS Mark I central bank. Miriam's working on New Zealand. Annie's working on Brazil. And the idea that by applying Mark II to different country experiences, they learn more from each other than basically just focusing on one model and one particular country experience and so on. So I think I would leave it there when it comes to thinking about how we train them. In terms of the technology that we use, so one of the latest things that we're into, Deanna's on the screen right now, and her and Svetlana are in charge of standards for things like charts. And so we're in the process of developing a website at the Global Forecasting School where the students will be able to share information about things like standards and charts and so on. This is all being built off of some software. It's the only software that we'll be using that isn't open source, but it's free to people as long as they're not using it for commercial purposes, in which case it's priced fairly reasonably. Now, what does high charts do? It does everything. So most of the the great graphics economics that you see in things like Fred and places like that, chances are that it's driven by high charts. What is high charts? Well, it's something that's malleable. What we're going to be using it is creating an editor that allows the economists to pick a particular type of chart that would be up to what our standards are, and they then fill out some fields that would fill out the title and the subtitles and the colors of the graphs, the lines, and blah 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 blah. Okay, so that's high charts, but our editor will do a lot more than that in the sense that it will also run a front end that will allow people to create scenarios with our core projection models. So the first one will be the quarterly projection model, which comes in two varieties. One is called endocred, which is a nonlinear model, what we refer to as a mixed complementarity problem, where we think of policy as being an optimal control problem. So we use quadratic objective functions. In the case of the United States, it's an asymmetric quadratic objective function because they don't seem to care about excess demand. They only care about full employment, maximum employment, and they don't seem to be too concerned about overheating. So quadratic objective function that can be asymmetric, and then a system of linear and nonlinear equations. The nonlinear equations include things like endogenous policy credibility that includes the basic insight that if you allow long-term inflation expectations to ratchet up or down, that it can be very costly to get inflation and inflation expectations re-anchored and so on. It also includes a nonlinear Phillips curve, which of course was really important for thinking about COVID, since when we think about that nonlinear or convex Phillips curve, we think of it as being driven by the proportion of firms in the economy that are facing bottlenecks. So that ended up being perfect during COVID. And of course, it includes effective lower bound on interest rates, which is an occasionally binding constraint and makes the problem really interesting because you could potentially fall into the dark corner of a low inflation trap like the euro area or like the Bank of Japan, or worse yet, deflation, like a Fisherian deflation, which is, of course, even worse than what the Bank of Japan fell into the last 3 decades, and so on. So that's the model. The model we think is we would describe it as a semi-structural model, where we embrace theory, but we don't marry it. So it has some of the key principles that you would want to put into any monetary policy model for guarding against the typical types of dark corners that central banks are concerned with. We also use a collection of other tools. R we use for basic econometrics, so like when we're estimating single equations and things like that. So Miriam, who's on the screen right now, is in the process of writing a working paper on the consumption function that uses R extensively. Now, the real workhorse behind the website is going to be Dynair Julia. It is going to be the thing on the back end. For people that know about Julia, it is as fast as compiled C code. And so it's just, for the types of things that we're interested in, which is solving these mixed complementarity problems and doing Bayesian estimation, it is extremely powerful. It is all ready to go, and we're already starting to put it into the back end applications and so on. So Dynair Julia for the back end. Why only for the back end? Well, it's pretty clear that Python is the program that everybody needs to learn as a general multi-purpose program. So given that everybody's going to be learning Python, you pretty well have to have Python being a really big part of the analysis and so on. So we're thinking of Python either being helping to drive the front end or being able to access anything that we do and compute in the system. These are just some calculations of some of the applications that we do. As I said, we have two of them. The mixed complementarity problem, which is just an optimal control problem where you have a nonlinear perfect foresight problem. The analogy here would be the international real business cycle model. And so you can just see the difference in performance from Dynero Julia versus Dynero MATLAB is staggering in some cases. And then, of course, the other aspect, which is the sister model to our nonlinear models. So every time we do a nonlinear model like EndoCred, we also construct a linearized representation of that we can then use the full battery of techniques that have been developed in Dynero. Once the model is linear, then we can estimate it with Bayesian methods. We can do all kinds of things. Now, the linear models that we have in mind, we can also think about generating impulse response functions that are very specific to particular episodes. And so we're trying to replicate the basic economic insights that are in our nonlinear models, but allowing us to estimate them. But we're not estimating them to tell us what the answer is. We're estimating them and teaching the students to be critical thinkers and to understand the problems associated with linear models. So that is basically the technology that we're working in. We're doing that in a collaborative environment where the Global Forecasting School and the Better Policy Project are basically providing resources for developing the infrastructure and so on. And of course, the National Bank of Georgia and the Central Bank of Armenia are contributing in ways that they can contribute, either by financing specific people that are working on specific projects. So the Central Bank of Armenia has hired a programmer effectively to take on the role that Michel Gilliard had developing Dynero Julia. The Better Policy Project has hired a programmer to develop the website to basically put all this stuff together. In addition to that, we have the Diligent Training and Research Center hosts a summer school. This year, unfortunately, it's all filled up. We have about 50 people registered. About 36 of those are undergrads from Ivy League schools. And so we'll be taking them through effectively a very short version of our FPAS Mark II over a period of a month or two in Diligent in July and August. And so another important aspect of our work is obviously doing research. And so this summer we'll also be pushing our research both in the development of models. The specific models that we're investing in are monthly models. So we're making the transition from quarterly projection models to monthly projection models because we think those models are going to be much more effective in terms of asking these three essential questions. Where is the economy today? What are the underlying forces? And of course, what do we need to do with our instruments to achieve our objectives? So moving from quarterly to monthly is really going to help us because we won't have to deal with that problem of building a bridge between high frequency data, daily and weekly and monthly data, and our quarterly projection exercise. So the other thing is research that's very much related to FPAS Mark II that is quite broad and can cover, in some cases, very specific things like what are better measures of underlying inflation. So on the screen we have a good example of non-traded sticky prices, which is this price index that we use to implement the framework that clearly delineates between traded goods prices and non-traded goods prices. So we have to keep track of those things, because when we ask the question, what do we need to do with our instruments to achieve our objectives, the exchange rate is a very important part of that story. So being able to differentiate between traded and non-traded goods is important. In addition, we find it very useful not to throw things out of the CPI. We don't like that, but to decompose the CPI into flexible prices and prices that aren't flexible, or what we refer to as sticky prices. So that separation can be really, really important for analyzing what's going on in various markets and so on. So the idea is that flexible prices move first because they're, by definition, flexible. And so you should be monitoring all these flexible prices, trying to understand if there's just idiosyncratic shocks that are driving those specific markets, or if on aggregate, there's excess demand pressures in those markets and it's showing up in flexible prices. If it is, then one has to respond sufficiently aggressively so that it doesn't show up in stickier non-traded prices and so on. Because once it gets into that, effectively the inflation psychology has taken hold in wage and price setting behavior, and it can be very costly then to effectively re-anchor long-term inflation expectations. And so that's another example, but it also includes things like issues about aging, migration, tons and tons of interesting research issues that are actually fundamental for understanding things like, what is the neutral interest rate? What is underlying potential growth? So there's a number of issues that are interesting there. And so I think on that note, I will end it and pass the floor to Yuri or to Bob.
Thank you, Doug. I think that was a really interesting example of then how you actually go about training people, building on Heik's presentation. That you use six-person teams to keep everyone communicating. And you also showed us some skills that you need to have that are very general, like current analysis, scenario building, communication, and modern macroeconomics. But then I think what was interesting that you enforced the point that Hayek made earlier, that being a generalist doesn't mean that you're not going deep into all of this, because you showed us a ton of software that the students would actually be working with and would be programming models in and doing econometrics in. So that looks to me like it's still similar to a top graduate program, right? In advanced macroeconomics, while also focusing on communication and scenario building. So how do you teach that then, like the communication part? Because I didn't see that in the presentation. How do you teach central bankers to communicate better? Oh wait, your mic is muted.
So Yuri, that's partly why we need people like you. Okay, I don't think economists have a comparative advantage in communication. I think typically the economists that we hire have struggle writing. They have problems explaining their ideas. They'll go away and they'll study things in a hierarchy system and won't spend time practicing, convincing people about what they might have learned, and so on. So I would say communications are emphasized every day, because the way that we practice the dynamic learning environment, it's all about internalizing what you've learned and trying to express what you've learned in presentations every day. So the students are tested to get level 1. They have to pass, they have to get 30 points. 10 points are for their presentation skills. 10 points are passing an IMF interview type of situation where they're asked, so they have to get 5 of those 10 points from really difficult questions, like in an IMF interview. And then 5 of the questions are easy questions. You can find in our working papers, we list what they are and so on. And then 10 writing assignments and so on. So they're tested every day on, or they're given the opportunity to be tested every day on one of these 3 categories and so on. So I would say that that would be the reason, that would be the way that we do it. We just give them the opportunity to practice. And then, of course, we give them lots of feedback and so on. So,
Okay.
but
Yeah,
we don't
makes...
have a magic, wand here. It's basically people just committing to wanting to improve, that are compatible with this dynamic learning environment and so on. So
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't have a magic communication wand either. I would say it's practice, 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 as with anything, right? Like anything that you need to learn. But with that being said, we still have one speaker left, and that is Robert Ford, who's going to reflect on Bernanke's report, as well as possibly everything that we've talked about so far. So, Robert, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I'm going to try and be quick because we're already over our hour allocation, so I don't want to keep it longer than I have to. Well, in general, in Bernanke's report, in a way, it's a very odd report. Not Bernanke's fault that it's an odd report, but he was commissioned to look into the forecasting issue, right? And yet, as he says in his report, the Bank of England has not been a bad forecaster during this period. It's not clear that they need to do anything to improve their forecasts, and it's not clear they can do anything to increase their forecast, to improve their forecast, in the sense of getting a smaller mean squared error or something like that, or less bias. And in my opinion is that nothing in the report is going to improve the forecasts, even if they do everything. In fact, I don't think the report's really about the forecasts at all. I think Bernanke, I have no inside information here. I think Bernanke more or less ignored the mandate and talked about how to improve policy analysis and therefore the outcome of monetary policies, which is the important issue, not the forecasts. So that was good that he did that. And so when I talk about the Bernanke report, you should keep that in mind. That's my sort of mindset going into this. It's not about forecasting at all. It's about policy analysis. And that's a good thing that it's about policy analysis. Bernanke did a good job in that respect. The FPAS-2 framework and stuff like that is broadly consistent with the Bernanke report in most respects, I think. I'm going to go through 3 things in particular. The first one is HR policy, which is not consistent with what the Bank of Armenia is doing. Bernanke has this view that people should specialize, and this almost class-based distinction between PhDs and non-PhDs, where PhDs are the upper class and non-PhDs are the lower class. Now, as I have a PhD, you might think that I'd be very sympathetic with this particular view, but I'm not. I think what the Bank of Armenia is doing is in fact the right thing, and what Bernanke suggests is in fact the wrong thing in this respect. I think monetary policy, macroeconomics in general, in fact, but in particular monetary policy, you need to have, I hate to use this term, but a holistic view of what's going on in the economy. There are a lot of moving parts, and it all boils down at the end of the day to an interest rate decision. And how to boil all that down requires broad knowledge of what's going on, broad views of what's going on. And it's important that I think that most staff at central banks, analytical staff at central banks, have to develop this broad view if they're going to properly engage in that process. And so moving them around, at least at first, is a really good idea. And training them in broad macroeconomic concepts and stuff is a great idea, a necessary idea. Of course, ultimately, some guys are going to be better than other guys at doing certain things. And so, as we know, as economists, you should take advantage of comparative advantage. So it's going to turn out ex post that some people were doing some things, research jobs, other people doing other things, modeling jobs, and so on and so on and so on. And there might be a correlation between those things and PhDs, or there might not be. Instead of putting PhDs in charge of everything, like Bernanke seems to suggest, you should put the best guys in charge of everything, whether they've got PhDs or not. And you should have an internal HR system that can identify those best guys and put them in where they're supposed to be. So much for that. Alternative scenarios and risks. Now, this is the FPAS-2. It's a big part of FPAS-2 is this, de-emphasizing the central scenario and posing risks. And so it's certainly consistent with Bernanke in that respect. But I think FPAS-2 is ahead of Bernanke. Bernanke's a little bit. I'm not too sure Bernanke has fully embraced the what's going on here in this report. And so I think FPAS-2 is in fact, in this respect, is a little bit ahead of Bernanke. But it's not far enough ahead. It's my criticism. I think everybody, but the Bank of Armenia in particular, since that's where we are, needs to do more on this sort of thing. And it's not a question of for me, it's not a question of this issue of central scenario and stuff like that. I mean, that's how it's being framed, but to me, that's a little bit of a distraction. To me, what the real issue is what are forecasts for? And or scenarios into the future. I'm not even going to talk about forecasts. My view is you can't forecast anything in economics more than a quarter or two out. That the notion that you can forecast a year out or 2 years out is illusory. It's not going to happen. None of those forecasts are ever going to come true. And the same is true of alternative scenarios. None of them are going to come true either for the same reasons. It's just they're not alternative. They're not alternative forecasts at all because there's no such thing as a good forecast. So the issue is risks, which is a big part of FPAS-2. This analysis of risks, and that's where they should go further. For me, at best, a forecasting process should be a way not of generating forecasts, because that's in some sense pointless, but of exploring risks. It could be useful as a framework to explore risks. You don't need a forecast to do that, but a forecast could be useful. A forecast process could be useful to explore risks. And in my experience, it's very hard to get guys to think about risks. I spent a lot of time at the OECD not doing forecasts, but supervising, and always encouraging desk guys to think about risks. And I don't know, they couldn't do it somehow. But I think that's a really important thing. It's not that any of those risks are going to come true. They're no more likely than any other thing to happen. But it helps you think about, well, what FPAS-2 talks about dark corners and all that kind of stuff, which I think is important to think about. So, to be to be a little bit more specific and constructive, a good way of starting off a forecasting round, I think, would be to have all your forecasting teams as individuals sit down in their own offices, and each one comes up with a dozen, let's say, risks, writes down a dozen risks that they think might happen, specific risks, not that the economy is going to be stronger than anticipated. That's not a risk. That's an alternative scenario. But why is the economy? What sort of things would make an economy look stronger? What sort of things would make an economy look weaker? What could go wrong? And then you have a meeting, and everybody comes with their page of risks, and you see if there's like common risks. Also, management get management in on this. The board of governors at this time, they should be asked to submit a dozen risks that they see as important, and then you can have a discussion about these risks. And I hope that there won't be too much disagreement there won't be too much agreement among staff about the risks. I want to see lots of risks, and then you can boil them down to the risks that you really think are important. But there's this, I don't know, in my experience, there's this issue of imagination up front about what risks are possible. You know, a nuclear bomb is dropped in Ukraine is a risk. Okay, what's that gonna? What does that mean for Armenia? What does that mean for Armenian monetary policy? Maybe nothing. There's nothing. Maybe there's nothing Armenian monetary else can do about that. Okay, fine. We've learned something. So that to me is I would emphasize risks much more in the process and also in the write-up. I agree with Bernanke that you shouldn't spend a whole lot of time in these monetary reports hashing over what the state of the economy has been and what it is now. What you should be talking about, and you shouldn't be spending a whole lot of time talking about the scenarios and the central thing. We should be spending a lot of time is talking about risks. And this brings me to my third thing, which is the new thing up here on the thing, this recommendation 4 and modeling. I agree with Doug that well, I don't know what I agree with Doug. I shouldn't put words in his mouth. Big models are a trap. They get very unwieldy. They're very expensive to maintain. They soak up huge amounts of intellectual resources to keep the dozens or hundreds of equations going. And in my experience, when it comes to the forecast or policy analysis, most of the time is spent by specialists overriding the model in the end of the day, putting in add factors and things like that. And so small models you need, but big models like this, putting in all this stuff into a model it would just be a waste of resources. On the other hand, I really like this recommendation. This recommendation lays out what I think are 5 really good ideas for research areas, all of which are really important for monetary policy. And not just for the central bank. I mean, it's really I think, for the macroeconomics profession in general. If you just take this thing and say, this is what the macroeconomics, the profession should look at over the next 10 years, I think that would be a really great research program. And so in that sense, if you took away the model part of it or the forecasting part of it, to me, this is a terrific roadmap ahead for avoiding the policy mistakes, not the forecasting mistakes, but the policy mistakes of this burst of inflation that we had. They're all important, and that's it for me.
All right. Thank you so much for these points of criticism / review of Bernanke's review. I totally agree that PhDs are not anything too much special. They're different. But actually, when I looked at Doug's program, I recognized almost some of my PhD classes. So why would you make that distinction? Totally agree. And I wonder maybe if Doug and Heike had some comments, especially on using the alternative scenarios more to explore risks. Even more, because especially given that you said like even more than it's now focused on in FPAS Mark II.
Hey, do you want to go first?
Okay, let me just very quickly, just to give you a sense how it actually happens, like from the practical perspective. Of course, when we are talking about the uncertainties and the risks and the sources for the uncertainties and the risks, we can think that there are infinite. The number of these scenarios that we can come up, this is infinite, right? So in that sense, how in practice we can organize that so that we can come up to a definite number of scenarios at the same time to help the board members actually to make a decision on policy. So in that sense, the process is designed a way that, okay, out of these infinite possible numbers, which in our minds are hovering somewhere there, the process is designed a way that the board members at every stages of the discussion, basically every week, we have this weekly rounds working with the board members, and also we have, especially in the policy round, we have this 2 weeks dedicated to talk with the board members. The design is the way that the staff members, policymakers, they all, at any point, if they come up with some uncertainty at the risk that they consider it to be important for their particular decision, this should be kind of taken note of. This is the way how we think of it, because obviously, as Bob mentioned, like this situation with Ukraine or what could happen there, earthquake, everything could happen there, right? But whether this is really relevant for the monetary policy at this current particular stage, whether we can somehow control our price stability risks with concentrating on that particular scenario or not, this is the question that we are all the time are asking. That's why we have this criteria of choosing the scenarios, in a sense. Criteria, but this is not a strictly kind of written criteria, but this is the criteria that we are using. This is the scenario should be related to the data, basically motivated from some data. The data is not only statistical one, but could be some information, something that we have heard. So there is a motivation that we have to think about this scenario. They have to be relevant for the monetary policy. This is related to the issue that Bob actually raised. So this should be related to the monetary policy for this current stage, and of course this should be also in a sense probable, right? We cannot talk about the scenarios which has low probability and at least very low kind of relevance for the monetary policy. We have to ignore, in a sense, those types of scenarios. But the process in practice goes the way. Whatever the uncertainty or the source of the uncertainty, the risk is or could be a relevant kind of point from any policymaker's perspective for them to make a decision, then it enters into this taxonomy of the scenarios that we have in the table. And that's also a good way also to communicate to the public how we do think about the particular risks at this point, because next round probably out of this whole list, something will drop out, some new ones will come in. That doesn't mean that the ones that dropped out, this is already becoming a certain or this is already becoming a reality. No, but that's already becoming, in a sense, less problematic, or less an issue for a board member while making a decision. This is how the process is going on in order to bring this infinite set of scenarios into something which is more definite and also is easy to communicate and basically is easy to make a decision on. That's the thing that I wanted to add. Thanks.
All right. And did you have a comment as well, Doug, on
Yeah,
point?
I just wanted to go back to the process, because I think we already do partly what Bob is asking for, in the sense that when we have that kickoff meeting, okay, right at the very beginning, so at that point, we present to the board what we think, all the different kinds of risks that either we have identified or have been identified by other people, and so on. And so in that early kickoff meeting, it's really about making sure that we've covered everything in that table. And we've also organized the table as a taxonomy. Okay. So for example, we take the scenarios and think about inflation and output surprising, whether positively correlated or negatively correlated. So in one of those quadrants, you would have stagflationary kinds of shocks driving the scenarios where it's going to be much more difficult for the central bank to be managing the output inflation trade-off. So the difference, Bob, the only difference that I heard from what you said and what we did is we don't ask all the board members to tell us about all the scenarios that they have in their mind. We kind of put it in front of them during this kickoff meeting, and then ask them whether or not it covers everything. And so and from that, we then ask them to draft along with two level 2 economists. So these are economists that have passed level 1 to draft one pager about what would be in their illustrative favorite case A and case B scenario. So I think the only thing that we're not doing, Bob, is asking the board directly to give us all their potential scenarios. We're providing a little bit of organization for them. So
I would say the thrust of my thing is that you're moving to the scenarios too quickly. I understand what Hayek's saying. He's right. You come up with maybe 100 risks, and you can't do 100. It'd be pointless. Even if you could, it would be pointless to do 100 scenarios and present 100 scenarios. Right? So for sure. You got some way of whittling it down to the manageable number, maybe 2 even. But I would argue for a little bit more pre-massaging before you end up talking about scenarios. I think the scenario formulation should come fairly late in the process, in my view. I think you should have these risks in mind. Let's say very specific risks, not that there's going to be stagflation. That's not a risk. That's a scenario. But before you get there, what are the sort of things that might generate this stagflation? Just much more free form than the idea of scenarios would suggest. And then, like Hayek says, yeah, sooner or later, you got to boil them down into scenarios, the ones that are going to generate the most, I wouldn't say probable exactly, but partly probable, but also partly, highly damaging ones. Some sort of expected cost kind of criteria. But I think that's what Hayek meant. So I'm just pushing, and I think that should be and I think that sort of thing should be reflected more in your write-up, rather than reducing everything to 2 scenarios, an up scenario or down, an A and a B scenario. I don't mind showing those 2 scenarios. That's another matter. I think the write-up should reflect a sort of expansive discussion of these individual risks, not the ones that are crazy or anything like the one I mentioned, but you don't want to talk about that. But these risks, and I think that would give people, it would go a long way to solving this issue that sort of dominates your discussion about the base case scenario and stuff like that people are underestimating the uncertainties and stuff like that. I think the way to, if you had a really good discussion about everything that could go wrong or right, I mean, there's good risks and bad risks, right? And in fact, they should, in some sense, be balanced. If your policy position is unbiased, in some sense, there should be risks on both sides, and otherwise, I think I think you should think about expanding this part of the operation rather than coming up with scenarios very early on, which basically precludes all this discussion in a way. Do that later on a little bit, and think about these risks, and think about, when you present the scenarios, just what risks they are embodying among this list of detailed risks that you come up with. and whether it's and that should ideally that would inform you how to think about the scenarios and how to present them also, right? So you'd say, okay, there's all these things that could happen. We're going to boil this down. It's going to look something like this, the A scenario, and there's all these other ones. We're going to boil all them down, and it's going to look something like the B scenario. But explain to people what you boiled down.
Yuri, if I can just 1 second make a remark here.
Yeah.
Because I have a pretty long history of working on what I would describe as successful modeling projects, all of which had to clean up failed modeling projects. Okay, starting with the Bank of Canada. Okay, and I would say the first project that I cleaned up was RDXF, which kind of had this kind of thing on the right hand side, kind of like a wish list for everything. So one of the things that we did with the development of the quarterly projection model in the early 1990s is wrote down a list of things that people wanted, and then we wrote down a list of things that weren't going to be in the model. And the successful projects would exclude a lot of things that are on the right-hand side of this page. In fact, I have never, ever seen one successful project start this way and ever be completed, and so on. There's an issue about letting perfection being the enemy of the good. At the end of the day, if you're going to be successful, the analytical framework that you develop, okay, including the models for helping to coordinate the projection process, it has to be consistent with the way the policymakers see the world. Okay, so it has to kind of satisfy that criteria. But does it have to have every possible detail in it? No chance that will ever succeed. So I think they should be far less ambitious and think about models as organizational devices, as opposed to trying to put all this stuff into one model. So I agree with Bob on that, but entirely. I think that's what you said, Bob, or
that sums up my views pretty concisely.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. I don't think we could have wished for any better way to round off this seminar then. And I think for everyone who stuck around till the end of the video, it's important to mention that the summer school, while it is full, it has a lot of the most exciting lectures will actually be available to those who want to watch them. But for that, you need to be on an email list, and for that, you need to email the Better Policy Project, where the email address will be available in the description of this video and on the website of the Better Policy Project. And so, with that being said, I think we are ready for a next seminar the next time.